Simplifying Accessibility, Preparing for the 2025 European Accessibility Act webinar. Today, we will look at the EAA from 3 different angles. This means first-hand insights from our accessibility specialist, Samuel Bergstrom, who's with us today. And a little later, front-end engineer Theodore Johnson and product manager Max Arnquist will join us. If this is your first time with us today, let me tell you a little bit more about who we are. Triton 37 is a technology consultancy based in Sweden with knowledge sharing in our DNA. From diversity initiatives and partnerships, hosting our own conferences, regularly holding knowledge events like this one today. We actively share knowledge with the communities around us, and we are so glad that you came to be a part of this knowledge sharing webinar today with Sam, Theodore, and Max. We still see that some of the people are still joining, so we will jump right to the agenda. A little disclaimer, as you may have noticed, this webinar is being recorded, but we will edit out all your names for social media posts and our YouTube recording for today's event, so worry not. And the presentation will end with a Q&A session. So please feel free during our panel discussion and our presentation, add your questions in the chat during the talk, as I will save them for later. Or you can also raise your hand at the end of the presentation when we come to the Q&A part and ask your questions directly to Sam, Theo, and Max. Samuel will start today's webinar with a short presentation. So before we jump into the discussion part, of course. So Sam, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Yes. Hi, everybody. So thank you very much for joining. And today we're going to talk about the European Accessibility Act. Now, the European Accessibility Act actually isn't anything too new. In a sense, it started already at 2019 when it came to power. And if we want to look at what is it exactly, it's an extension of what we see today in physical domain, where you cannot build a certain building, for example, without making it accessible for everyone. You cannot, do a shop or even renovate your house without taking into account accessibility. So it's an extension of the physical requirements that we see today, but in the digital domain. And what happens is that starting June 2025, we're going to see a lot of the accessibility requirement that until today were maybe reserved for authorities, now actually being applied to private entities in specific industries. And at the end of the day, it's really just about ensuring that as many people as possible have a right to use a service and not discriminating based on abilities. When we look at what accessible services are by definition, even that is kind of like an old thing. Like even looking at 1999, we already see like the first version of what the guidelines are for making things accessible online on the web. And since then, there's a lot of recommendations, guidelines available for making other things available, for example, physical spaces, documents, and so on and so forth. So when we're looking at the European Accessibility Act, what they try to do is to unify the different guidelines that we have. Because if we look at the web content accessibility guidelines, it's basically guidelines that apply to web only, and they're international. So in a sense, it's kind of a version which is European that applies to more things than just web accessibility and is standardized for all the countries. Now, if we are looking at kind of like who is affected, there's a lot of different products that are being affected. And by products, I mean you can have mobile phones, TVs, computers, and so on and so forth. But they are not really that interesting to look into. I think that when it comes to services, it's actually a lot more interesting. So what this new directive defined is 7 different industries where services have to be made accessible. And among these industries, you have different communications, such as email, chats, video conferencing, so on and so forth. Media services, For example, streaming services, play services, TV boxes, and so on. All the transportation services, mostly consumer facing, in which case we're talking about web services, about apps, ticketing machines, any type of interactive terminals that consumers might interact with. Banking services, ebooks, and interestingly, e-commerce sites. So even the idea of people being able to buy online is being covered by this new regulation. Yes. Now, the regulation itself applies to all organizations that operate within the EU, but there are some exemptions. So, for example, if you're considered a micro company or smaller organization, you will be exempt. And in that regard, you will not have to to ensure accessibility if your organization has an annual revenue of less than 2 million euros or fewer than 10 employees. There are other exemptions as well, but I don't think we need to go into the details. So I think it is really important that until now we're kind of talking about compliance, right? But accessibility isn't really about compliance. It is about helping people. It is about ensuring that as many people can use your service as possible and that as many people can actually be your customers. And in most cases, accessibility and usability kind of go hand in hand. So when you're making something more accessible, you're making it more usable for everyone. And that is kind of the differentiation that I think we would like to people to have in mind, right? That really, if you're talking about compliance, this is really about like the legal part of things. It's about being able to defend yourself in court. But if you're working actively with making your services available and accessible for as many people as possible, you would most likely never end up in court. And in a sense, it's very like important to make that distinction, because if you're looking at just the legal compliance threshold, what is good enough, right? It is WCAG 2.1 level AA. Great. What does that mean? It's a mouthful. That actually just means that every element on your service and supporting services must pass 50 different success criteria. That doesn't say a lot, right? But even if you do that, then you're compliant. It doesn't mean that you're accessible. If you want to be accessible, you kind of need to work based on the current standards that are not part of the legislation. It's kind of like building a house. You can comply to the standards that have been there since the 70s. So you can like go through your checklist and, you get your approval to go and start construction, or that you can try and do things based on the current best practices. And that is always updating. So that's why I see that like accessibility is way more about the technical aspect of ensuring that everybody is able to use your services than just looking at the compliance side of things.
All right. So in just a few seconds, Max and Theo will join us. We have been having some difficulty getting them online, so I apologize for that. I know that Theo is on his way as we speak. So I would like to ask you, Sam, maybe you can help me with the question that was meant for Max, but I know you have a lot of knowledge on this topic. So from the business importance of digital accessibility, why do you think digital accessibility is crucial for businesses beyond just the legal compliance that you just mentioned?
Yeah, of course. Well, the legal compliance is just one part of it, right? You don't want to get sued. But what is even more important is the fact that you want to actually be able to serve as many people as possible, right? There is the concept of a total addressable market. And by making sure that things are accessible, you're increasing that market share, or like the potential market share, by between 16 to 36%, depending on what statistic you look into. But that's a huge, huge, huge thing. it's really like a magical thing that all of a sudden you make things better for everyone. You get a much larger total accessible market, addressable market, and you're reducing your legal compliance. And then there is another side bonus that a lot of the assistive technologies, they are, and assistive technologies, in case somebody is wondering, is really the technologies that people that might have different disabilities use in order to navigate the web. These assistive technologies are mostly kind of like, let's call it agents or computer agents that are serving the content in a way that people can consume. So a lot of these are actually just machines. By making your website more machine readable and machine friendly, you're actually improving the way that other machines, for example, search engine crawlers and other services, are going to consume your site, which means that you're getting a much higher page ranking. So better for everyone, better for your business, better from a compliance standpoint, and much better from a page ranking and search engine optimization perspective.
All right, so win-win situation. And speaking of a win-win situation, Theo joined us under the name of Petra Ranhem.
Hello.
What's going on? Hello, Petra. How are you doing?
Well, hello. Yeah, my name is not Petra, obviously. As always, there are some technical difficulties whenever you try to do these things. But,
and here we go again, yeah, but thank you for joining us nonetheless. And as we go to topic number 2 today, accessibility from the PM design and tech perspectives. So when it comes to front-end developer, so if anyone missed it, Theo is a front-end developer at Written 37, and he is going to give us a point of view for a front-end development on accessibility. And my question for you, Theo, is what are the common challenges front-end developers face when implementing accessibility features?
That is a good question. I think as developers, we tend to take shortcuts. I can only speak for myself. I'm kind of shooting down the whole development team here, but we often build things and say that's good enough, and in itself that's not a bad idea. You make something functional and beautiful and good enough, and then we tend to move on. But I think we forget that we need to raise that bar and like include accessibility in good enough of our development, and it's really not rocket science. If we just use HTML elements, the building blocks for creating websites, we're kind of covered from an accessibility standpoint. I think one of the problems that often comes up is that we end up recreating native HTML elements and functionality that already exists. And there are a lot of aspects that you need to take into account. For example, like area labels, keyboard navigation, how screen readers would interact with elements. So a lot of it is just making semantic HTML, which means use the correct HTML elements where you need them. And yeah, that's one big thing. I think that's the biggest thing. But another thing is like third-party providers that you use on your websites. Are they accessible? Login, authentication, pre-built components. You are responsible for making sure that all of these assets are accessible on your websites, and that's something I think where we need to step up.
But authentication is not a part of the legislation, but it is a part of accessibility, right?
Yeah.
So how do you, for example, prepare accessible CAPTCHA?
Yeah. CAPTCHA, everyone loves CAPTCHA, where you're supposed to look at the low quality pictures of traffic lights and press all of them. So like, yeah, how does a blind person select all the traffic lights? And they don't even need to be fully blind. Perhaps to just have a deteriorating eyesight. Hands up. I know I can't see you guys, but who has a deteriorating eyesight? I'm just kidding. The point is, like, if you cannot make out low quality pictures in a CAPTCHA, using CAPTCHA as your only alternative for authentication automatically makes your website inaccessible for a bunch of people. Maybe you even have like good eyesight. You're young, handsome, fresh. Hands up. I'm still just kidding. Even if you have good eyesight, but you just have like a sun glare, like me sitting in my office right now. If the sun comes in on my screen, all of a sudden authentication using CAPTCHA is like close to impossible. So to sum it up, providing alternatives is the thing that you need to do for your users. Accessibility boils down to that, providing alternatives. So yeah, to answer the question, how do we provide an accessible CAPTCHA?
Yeah.
An alternative to like a visual CAPTCHA would be an audible CAPTCHA. There are those things where you listen in and they make a lot of background noises, and then you listen for certain keywords and you type those in. So yeah, you can use an audible CAPTCHA, for example. There are several ways, but that's one of the ways you can do it.
Okay, so there are many ways, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, depending on who you're trying to make it accessible for. That makes sense. But when it comes to design part, Samuel, how can designers integrate accessibility principles into their workflow from the onset?
You know what? I just actually thought about something because you kind of poked me there, but in the good old days of design, right, there was an idea of universal design, that you're designing one thing and it works for everyone. And then there is an interesting counter story about, when US pilots they tried to remake the cockpit, and they tried to design a cockpit that would serve as many people as possible, right? So they looked at a lot of different parameters like height, and like arm reach, eyesight, where do people tend to look, and to make sure that everything would be like as good as possible for the pilots. What they realized is that actually, like, I think it was 0 out of like a sample size of thousands of pilots that actually matched all the average criteria. It's kind of important that when we're designing to remember that the average is the sum of all the abnormalities, right? Like nobody has exactly the same, arm length and exactly the same eyesight. So when we are experiencing things, we cannot use universally accepted design. What you need to make is design that is inclusive and design that is accessible. Now, when I'm talking about designers, I think that like historically we got a lot of shit, kind of like unrightfully so. I mean, designers were asked to the designers were the ones to blame for things not being accessible, while design in itself is only playing like a certain part in the accessibility game, right? So Theo would not be able to develop an accessible software if he's not getting an accessible design from me. And I am not being able to create an accessible design, or maybe I am able to, but I will not be able to prioritize that unless the PMs actually make sure that there is time for it. And they will not be able to make time for it unless the business decides the priority. And even if we make sure that everything is kind of already technically in place to make an accessible experience, there is all the content that actually goes into our shell of a product that then needs to be made accessible. So the way that, and this is kind of a long rant, right? But the way that I think that designers need to incorporate accessibility principles into their daily work is really about defining what is, first of all, what is accessible, and ensuring that things follow a certain standard. When designers are using design systems, then you can actually make sure that the design systems are by default already accessible. That would not solve everything, right? But that's already a good start. And then you need to annotate designs so developers would know things, for example, like focus order, things that we are typically potentially designers are very bad at, like maybe we are not really great in valuing function over form. So in a lot of cases, in the name of like minimalism, designers would remove a lot of very functional elements that help everybody, but maybe they're cluttering the experience. So like designers should, I think, in my eyes, kind of get the theoretical knowledge about what accessibility is, what the requirements are, what applies to their work, and then they need to kind of do no harm. Like we just need to not make it worse before it ends up in the hands of the developers.
Theo, do you have any feedback for what Sam just said? I wonder.
I love it. Don't make it worse before it comes to the hands of the developers. I think. I agree totally on that point. I think one of the, if we're talking about like challenges of making stuff accessible for everyone, it's like I said, it's all about providing alternatives, and I think that could play into a big part of being a developer, where it's like we have a lot of issues at hand, you have a lot of problems to solve at hand, and how are we gonna attend to all of these? We already do that with like different browsers, different screen sizes, all of this to make things accessible, and we do this very well. But we just need to level it up, as I said before. So yeah, just raise the bar, I guess.
Mm.
Always. Okay, so when it comes to the next part, oh, maybe I missed something. Maybe this could be question for one of you. I know that product management, you have a lot of experience with product managers, right? But from your point of view, what do product managers need to know about accessibility? And jump in, any one of you who thinks it can answer this.
Yeah.
Not at the same time.
I can even raise my hand.
Go, Sam.
No, but look, I was, part of my career, I was sitting as a product manager. But and as a product manager, you're always trying to kind of evaluate what would make what would bring most value, to the company, to the users, and to how to maximize the value you're creating. And you're balancing a lot of different requirements and a lot of different requests, and you need to kind of like be the person who prioritizes and makes the tough calls about what would make the cut and what wouldn't make the cut. And when it comes to accessibility, for a long time, a lot of companies, they haven't done accessibility, not because they were evil. That was never the case, right? But accessibility was simply never prioritized. It was never a priority. And a lot of things just took precedence. So in a sense, I think the product manager's role is to make sure that there is kind of room for the team to do these accessibility improvements. It will take time, and that time needs to be allocated. So the product manager kind of needs to work both with management to work upwards and evangelize or be the advocate for why accessibility is important, and then towards the team to make sure that they have access to the right resources, that they have enough time to conduct things, and potentially just working towards accessibility as a goal, putting it as something that we're working towards, because it's not a project, it's not a one and done. When you're working with accessibility, you actually have to continually, it's kind of just adding an additional requirement for what is good enough, right? So you need to ongoingly work with making things more and more accessible.
Theo?
Yeah, I think just talking about it more and having like from a PM point of view, I guess this should be like a main staple of what we're doing. This should not be a second-hand thing that we add on to our projects. It should always be something that's integrated in the whole, like to whatever that we're building. This should be integrated part of that. And I feel like now I'm speaking as a developer again, but I feel like this involves like the PM role, I guess, is to have like education on these things, or maybe even higher up than PM role, to have like educating on this point, because for me at least, it was later on in my career where I kind of felt like accessibility was I kind of treated it as a second-hand thing. But if you meet these people and you listen to these people that are like, they really need something to be accessible, to be able to use it, then you have that person in mind when you're developing something. At least that's how I work. Or when you're designing something, or when you're building something, and then you can think of that person that needs to have it catered in a certain way to be able to use that product. And for me, that helps me to remind myself of building stuff accessible. So,
but when we're building
education on it.
accessible, sorry, I
No,
jumped in.
just having education on it.
Okay. And speaking of education, how would you involve any stakeholders or non-technical people?
Sam, you want to take that one?
Sure. But I think that I mentioned it before, kind of like we are talking about a product as kind of a cohesive thing, right? But a product is really about the code, the design, and the content that the product has. So Theo and I can actually sit together and develop the most accessible product from a technical standpoint. And then we hand it to the people that need to make sure that there is content into it, like content creators and different UX writers and whatnot. If they are writing in a very convoluted way, using very complex language filled with jargon, we are not going to have an accessible product, right? There is a certain like misconception, and the level of literacy, like the average level of literacy in the United States, for example, is between 7th and 8th grade. And that is the average. And that is kind of the situation around the world, that even in very like literate countries, we can't ensure that everybody has the same vocabulary that we might use. And we tend to believe that everybody is like us, right? But if we think about people that are potentially dyslexic, or just even people that move from a different country, that Swedish is not their mother tongue, you know, our vocabulary would be a lot more, a lot more. It's kind of funny as a foreigner now that the only word that I have in mind is begränsad. And I don't know how to translate that to like, it would be limited.
Limited, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I got like, what? I'm not going to try to repeat that.
But in a sense, so we need to make sure that everybody is aware of what accessibility is and that everybody is doing their role. And I kind of totally agree with Theo about like including accessibility from the start is so easy compared to retrofitting accessibility, right? Like if you have that from the beginning and you get the management buy-in and you have the organization backing you into it as a goal, it's so much easier to actually like do that than to then later on try and rectify everything that was wrong. So in a sense, like making something accessible is not more time consuming. Of course, there is a tad bit more work involved, but if you look at like the broader picture, it's not more time consuming than making something very inaccessible, while retrofitting something very inaccessible and trying to tweak that would be extremely hard. So advocacy internally and getting kind of the management buy-in to do things like right from the start, and to ensure that even people in non-technical roles are aware of, you know, what accessibility is and what role they play in, I think is extremely important.
Non-technical also, but some management is technical. But when it comes to management, how important do you think it is to have their buy-in in this?
Oh, it's vital. It's like one of the best quotes I heard regarding accessibility is that like all the accessibility problems in the world, you know, could be solved if a CEO says like we expect our product to be accessible. And I think it's like it's so easy, you know, if management defines the expectations, then the organization will follow.
That's a very good point. Theo, do you have anything to add to that?
Sounds perfect. No? Every organization should just buy in, and then it trickles down. Because it's really hard with whatever you're trying to do. It's really hard to work from the bottom up. It's way easier if it comes from top down. So yeah, management buy in, and it's an easy win. I mean, if you're having an accessible site, talking about the web page now, it just like there are so many more people that can use your website, so many more potential customers, whatever you're doing. It's a no-brainer really to have something accessible. It's just a win-win for everyone.
All right. So when it comes to taking the first steps, Theo, this is a question for the both of you. So what are some practical things that you can share for people looking to take the first steps into improving their digital accessibility. And Theo, since your mic is hot, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there are a couple of things that you can do. As I said previously, the biggest one is to write semantic and well-structured HTML. This will take you most of the way. So do that. And it's way easier, as Sam mentioned, if you do that from the start, it's way harder to adjust it later on. So write semantic HTML, and then try to prioritize native browser features over creating your own custom JavaScript features. Because JavaScript does a lot of things that screen readers can't interpret correctly. So you have to look out for that if you make customizations. Sometimes you have to do that, but then just keep that in mind. And then also, I think including accessibility in your testing. So you could set up like your CI/CD or have like, I don't know if you have like weekly testing or whenever you're creating like a feature or something, make sure that your testing is this accessible as well. And then one thing that this is not probably like a quick fix, but something that we definitely should do is making it engaging for developers. I don't think anyone likes being told what to do. And to be frank, like accessibility, for me at least, isn't the sexiest thing in the world. So instead of saying, if we come to like a developer point of view, instead of saying to them, make it accessible, poke the problem solver in them. Like we have a problem here and we need you to find and implement a solution to it. Because I think that if you get the developers on board, I think this is game over. They're going to make super accessible everything. That's how we work. So yeah, those are some key points, I think.
Lovely. But I do think that Samuel thinks accessibility is very sexy. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't know if sexy, designers actually had for a long time a very like a harsh criticism about making things that are beautiful and accessible. But I think accessibility is very interesting. And personally, like I have kind of like vested interest, like I think a lot of people think about accessibility as kind of like something to cater with people with disabilities, but that's really not my point of view about things, right? I think that it makes a better experience for everyone. And if we're talking about like taking the first steps, and this is really not designer specific, but if you have a product, I give you like the 1 hour challenge or the 5 minutes challenge, right? But try and use your product for 5 minutes without using the mouse. That would give you so much of like an insight as to what people that use assistive technologies and how they experience your product. And I assure that after that, if you convince your CEO to do that, and they spend like an hour being frustrated by not being able to use their service, you would actually be able to get a lot more buy-in to making things accessible. And I think when it comes to just designers, making sure that designers understand that the guidelines are not really a checklist. It's not really where accessibility ends, it's where accessibility starts. And to understand that even these guidelines change, like designers in a sense are a bit like developers here, being very dogmatic, like there's the right way or the wrong way. And like you forget that it's really not about reaching a certain threshold, but it's really about making sure that people can, for example, with contrast ratios, it's not about, now it's 3:1 or 4.5:1. It's not about that. It's about ensuring that people, whoever they are, or wherever they are, can read the content. So, for example, with contrast ratios, this standard, the way that we're calculating contrast, it's going to change. So it's really about not being dogmatic and saying like, now it is great, because like, no, well, now it's great according to a standard that was set, back in the early 2000s. We have learned things from since then. So kind of like learning and evolving and not following blindly a checklist.
That's very well put. And this is a great segue into our next topic, which is conducting accessibility reviews. And just before we get into that, I just want to say we got 3 questions, and we will get to them as soon as we get to the Q&A part. If anybody else has a question, just be sure to write it in, and we will answer all of them, worry not. So when it comes to conducting accessibility reviews, Sam, the threshold for compliance is no. But what a lot of companies do not know is where they are today in that threshold. So are there any tools to check where they are and what work needs to be done?
There are a lot of tools, right? There is a lot of different tools, either automated tools to analyze how the page is from, performance, SEO, blah, blah. That's kind of like something the developers probably would relate to. Lighthouse in the Chrome developer tools is one tool, but Lighthouse is really bad in identifying accessibility, like if in identifying accessibility issues.
Why?
Why? Well, to start with, like the best accessibility testing tool today, right, is only able to identify about 58% of the accessibility issues. And that is a huge progress compared to 37% that was in the past. So we are kind of getting better at automatically identifying problems, but there's a lot of problems that are very hard to identify for a computer. So for example, to ensure that an alt text describes the author's intent properly, like you can have a picture of a person, which is on the page to show the person, or maybe it is to show the outfit of the person, or potentially it is to show how different exposures would impact the end result. That would lead to different descriptions of the same image. That is something that, for example, automated testing tools can't really help you with. And a lot of things end up being very contextual, like when you need alt text, what images are decorative or what images are informative, what are vital for users to understand and not. They are very, very contextual. So Lighthouse and even better tools like Wave or WebAIM, as Axe and so on, they're not great. They will never be. And the same with Accessibility and other widgets for automated kind of let's call it auto-accessible widgets. They're really bad because in a sense you're just trying to take a very non-compliant, non-accessible service and bolt on some accessibility features. Eventually, the features cannot interact properly with your site unless you're actually building it the right way. So when it comes to automated testing and things like that, it's never going to replace humans. And even humans, I think, need to complement their testing with assistive technologies. So when you're trying to look at how to analyze where you are today, it is really a combination of trying to think as a human, trying to put yourself in the user's shoes, select the flow, and go through the flow using assistive technologies, or using only keyboard navigation, or using some manual checklist for accessibility, or by using automated tests. You kind of need to combine all of them.
So basically, it is important to have a human eye on it as well. But what would you say are the key components of a digital accessibility review?
I think I just mentioned that. It's kind of like the 4, right? Like you need a combination of looking through a single flow, looking from a user's standpoint, kind of having accessibility personas sometimes help. You combining automated tools that are really great into looking through a lot of content in a very short time, but they are not great in actually identifying all the problems and are not great in actually not giving you false positives or negatives. So kind of combining that with a sanity check of a real person and combining that with assistive technologies.
All right. This was basically, Farhad, this was your question as I'm reading them now. So if we have answered your questions, just let us know. If you have any follow-up questions about it, type it in the question as well. And before we go to the Q&A part, We have covered a lot so far. I think you will all agree. And before we turn to your questions, we just want to let you know that we will be sending out a list of recommended resources for those who are looking to take a deeper dive into this topic. So keep an eye on your email inbox soon. We also offer a digital accessibility review, which Sam mentioned a little bit about not a few moments ago. The goal here is to provide you with a clear understanding of where you are in digital accessibility, so you can have a better understanding of your gaps and what needs to be done to reduce your risk and increase your accessibility. And speaking of great questions, it's time for you to shine. So Farhad, if you need a follow-up or anything else to be answered for your question, let us know, and I will jump to the next one, which is from Anders. And he said, in an organization having services that should comply with the Accessibility Act, who do you think should be responsible? I think I'm curious to pinpoint a clear ownership rather than saying it is everyone's responsibility. So who would like to take this one? It's a very good question.
Oh, it's a great one. I just want to say that I totally agree with that, because there is that kind of old saying that, when it's everybody's responsibility, then it's kind of no one's. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to assign ownership. You need to have somebody who's driving it and somebody who's coordinating the efforts. And when it comes to even just some of the non-technical aspects of accessibility, you need to document your current accessibility status. You need to, on an ongoing basis, evaluate and update that documentation. And you even need to be able to allow users to report accessibility deviations, and then to be able to follow up with these users and how you're handling it. So you have to have somebody who's responsible for it and driving it.
I agree on that point, where you need to have someone that's responsible for it. But I still think it's so important that you have, I mean, it doesn't go against it, but that you have full buy-in. Because if you have, as we talked about before, accessible design, but the developers don't implement that properly, or if you have accessible design and an implementation of developers, but then you have a language, as Sam talked about earlier, that is a jargon that is it's hard to understand for our users, then it's not accessible either. So we should have someone that's driving this and someone that is responsible in that way on a higher level, but everyone needs to shoulder the responsibility, because otherwise this thing doesn't work.
Mm. And Max Almquist also commented at Anders saying the natural owner is the product owner or product manager. Do you agree with that one?
In a product team, it's correct, right? Like if you're thinking inside the product team who is responsible, then the answer is yes. Maybe the product manager is responsible for several product teams, right? And then it would be correct as well. But I think there is kind of there should be somebody higher up who's taking it on themselves to be responsible, so that even people who are not from a product team, but even kind of somebody who has the mandate and the ability to allocate resources, allocate time, I think that makes more sense in larger organizations. But of course, in the smaller organizations, then yes.
Melanie also asked a fantastic question. What do you think? Which area should the person responsible sit in? Calculating. That's a very good question. Brain scratcher for sure.
Well, the thing is that I don't really think that there is a natural place where that person should fit, because I was kind of considering that beforehand, right? But it's not really just about product. It's not really just about marketing or about IT or about tech. It's kind of a combination of everything that person kind of needs to be the spider in the web. So I don't know what would be the natural place for that person, but it should be somewhere where they are given the mandate from the organization, and of course they are accountable for the accessibility initiative, and whatever title that they find, wherever the person sits, they will need to coordinate anyhow with so many different parts of the organization to make it happen.
Very true. Matilda asked a question that's quite similar to this, what you just said. So if you can't get management buy-in, do you think it's worth it to start working towards better accessibility only from design or only from development as a start, or will it just create a lot of depth for later?
It's a good question, and
Very.
And it's kind of like you want to avoid creating debt, right? So if you can avoid creating accessibility debt or design debt or technical debt, you should. But the problem that you would have is that you will not be able to fix things in a systematic way. So new things, you probably would try and make sure that they're kind of following a certain standard and a certain way of doing things that is accessible, but actually fixing things that have already been created and reducing the accessibility debt, that I think requires a bit more time, and in that case it requires a bit more buy-in. So like there is a number being thrown out there between 100 hours to 1,000 hours to make a service accessible. It's really kind of like the amount of debt, the complexity of the product, it all plays a role there. And I think that in a sense, of course, designers do no harm, developers do no harm, like don't make it worse. But I think that when it comes to actually fixing it, it needs to be more of a decision taken by leadership to allocate the time and actually make that into an organizational goal.
Mm. And I think I talked about that before, like it's way easier, as you say, Sam, if it comes top down, but this could also be a way, if it's possible, to work bottom up. Like if you would focus on making it accessible in design and development, and then show that to like higher ups to be like, okay, hey, this is what we've done, and this is the amount of value that it creates. Like these are so many more percentage of our users can actually use our product now, and this helps us in X, Y, and Z way. I think that's one of the ways that you can work from bottom up and then get buy-in. It's a harder way to go, but it's better than not making it accessible. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I just want to, the next one is not a question, but I still want to read it out. Sarah mentioned something really interesting. With GDPR, you need to have an assigned responsible data controller. Perhaps within a few years, we will have to get a controller for accessibility, but it will still be the company as a whole that is responsible. In Ireland, they give direct jail time to the CEO. I hope we do not go that harsh with this one.
Yeah. If you look at the recommendations that you can find in different places, it is recommended that there will be somebody who's responsible for that, right? And I don't know if we would come to a point where, the CEO would go to jail, but as a service provider, and I think that is very important to note, as a service provider, you are responsible that your services and all services that you depend on. So for example, if you have a web shop, even the payment providers that you will choose need to be accessible. If they are not providing an accessible solution, this is your fault, because you should have actually gone with a public tender to find an accessible solution. So parts of the service that are not accessible, even if they're a third party, are your responsibility. Even supporting parts of the service, for example, customer service, delivery, fulfillment, Q&A, what do I know? They are still part of your responsibility for accessibility. So I don't want to see that, accessibility responsible role being the one who gets who takes the risk in case of an infringement. I don't think that is what the notion of the law is, but it's about organizations themselves being accountable for whatever infringement that happened.
Nice one. And I have to read, we have two more. So Gazy said, accessibility has been competing with the AI hype at the moment. Can you see any use cases where AI can support the A11Y implementations? You started nodding immediately.
Yeah, like I think that probably Theo would be able to like think of other things, but I know of, for example, auto alt text suggestions can be and are already to a certain extent being provided. So like you can use AI and to both identify different images and provide with alt text suggestions in order to provide accessibility. In a sense, I think it's kind of hard because AI would tend to describe the content of the image and not the intent of the content contributor in that regard. But it's still like an interesting step forward. And I think that like, I don't know who used screen readers. If there are any people who used screen readers, it's a very frustrating experience. That I think that eventually that type of creating a website, styling it, adding JavaScript, adding CSS to it, and then stripping everything away and serving it into a screen reader for people to consume, that type of kind of like very convoluted way from actually creating something to what people consume. I think that would probably be optimized in the future. More or less think of, in the same way that an AI can summarize an article, I think an AI would be able to summarize like what are the main actions that you can do on this page, what are the main things that are there that you can actually interact with the AI in order to query what is the content of the web page, and using AI as an assistive technology. But I think that would maybe happen more on the operating system level.
Theo, do you have any comments on this one?
No, I thought it was really, really, really interesting, the first point that you made with the alt text, Sam, and I think on your point that where an AI would describe the image, more of the intent of the writer, I think that you can solve that with AI as well, where they would just gather more information of the text or whatever you're writing or whatever you're showing, and then probably make out a pretty good alt text on that point. That's really interesting. I haven't looked into that personally, but that's, I mean, the future is here. So yeah,
this is your cue.
This is your cue here.
This is your cue, Theo, now, like for
probably
collaboration.
I guess so. Next webinar.
Gazy had a follow-up question saying, should internal applications be accessible? The easy question, but not an easy answer, right?
Well, I can't be 100% sure here, but I know that the intention of the law is really consumer-facing interfaces. So I would suggest that like legal questions, you need to consult your legal department, right?
Yeah.
And I would probably try to avoid, giving like no, yes. I can't give a black and white answer here.
Fair. Yeah. That's very fair.
Yeah. Legally, don't know. Should they? Of course.
Okay, it's short and sweet.
Yeah.
We had a question from Leon saying, to convince stakeholders often comes to a time and cost invested. How would you take this in a sense of return on investment? Or let's say, what are the business growth benefits for organization?
Yeah, we spoke about the increased potential addressable market, right? And this is kind of like, I used to look at it as kind of like a simplified example. Like if you have, for example, a cafe, and you have a lot of steps in order to actually get into the cafe,
mm-hmm.
Then, or you just have a sign, parents are not welcome here, then it's quite likely that parents will go to a different cafe, right? in the same time, that if you had a ramp where people that maybe have a baby wagon or are using a wheelchair or maybe are using like a rollator, they would be able to buy at your cafe, you're simply increasing your customer base. So
That's a very good example. Very, very good example.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a no-brainer that you can actually increase your customer base.
All right. Ranjit, as Samuel and Petra, please note that Petra is Theo. What are some common challenges you faced in making your applications accessible? So what are some of the most common challenges you faced in making your applications accessible, and how have you addressed them? Do you have any experience on this topic,
Yeah,
Petra?
I think Thank you for the question. I think I mentioned that before, but when we're building custom solutions on the web, it's hard to make things more accessible because you need to take in consideration how a screen reader would interact with your content, and like focus states and things that are toggled on and off, invisible content, all of that. You need to make sure that those things. Now, this is very technical, but I'm a developer, so that's what you get.
Yep. This is why you're here.
Yeah, exactly. All of that is I think one of the most challenging things, and just have an eye out for that. And really, if you want to make it, as I said, simple for yourself, use the native HTML, write semantic HTML. But in those cases where you need to make it custom, spend some time making sure that it's also accessible.
All right. Thank you very much, Theo, Petra. I think this is all the time that we have for today. We have 1 minute left, so I don't want to take too much of everyone's time. There were, like, maybe you have noticed, maybe not, probably you did. Theo, Petra, and so on. We have been having some technical difficulties today. So convenient. So Max was not able to join us in this session, but we will film his part of the presentation that we prepared today and follow up on the email that you will get. So all of the attendees today that signed up will get an email with Max's insights as well. And thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Theo. Thank you, Samuel. Thank you, Max. I know he's on standby and he's answering questions in the chat. So this was a really exciting discussion. And to everyone who has joined us, we will send you Max's part and a list of recommended resources along with the recording of this webinar in a few days. So keep your eyes open in your email inbox. And thank you everyone for joining, for being here, for asking all these amazing and fantastic questions. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in our next webinar. And until then, have a fantastic rest of the week and amazing summer ahead of us. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Petra out.
Thank you, Petra.